Good evening and welcome to On the Record. I'm your host, Adam Jasser. A parliamentary vote in Georgia returned the pro-Russian governing party to power amid reports of voter intimidation, ballot box stuffing and other irregularities. The result marks yet another triumph of illiberal democracy, if you will, in Central and Eastern Europe. And that is music to Vladimir Putin's ears as Moscow works to re-establish its influence in the former Soviet bloc. And it is done in broad daylight. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, Russia's top ally in Europe and the self-appointed champion of illiberal democracy, rushed to Tbilisi to laud the dubious victors.
The Hungarian Prime Minister was obviously delighted to be in Tbilisi.
Viktor Orban supported Georgian dream main narrative that without this party Georgia would be dragged into war and could become a second Ukraine.
With the ruling Georgian dream poised to stay in power, European Union representatives from several key member countries made clear the election was tainted by the irregularities and moved the country even further away from its goal of joining the bloc.
Due to the course of action taken by the Georgian government, EU leaders have stopped Georgia's accession process. It remains on hold as long as Georgia continues to move away from the European Union, our values and our principles.
The democratic backsliding in Georgia is part of a wider trend in Central Europe, where some parties seek to change the level playing field after winning elections. The playbook, pioneered by Orbán and later adopted by Poland's previous administration and the new government in Slovakia, is often similar. It starts with capturing nominally independent institutions, packing courts, and increasing the state's influence over the economy. Recent democracy rankings reflect the resulting damage to democratic checks and balances and quality of governance. Slovakia's latest ranking is from 2023, before the reins of power in the country passed from the pro-Ukraine mainstream to Prime Minister Robert Fico's pro-Moscow leftist party early this year. Fico immediately began to adopt the Orbán playbook, capturing institutions and public media, while branding the free media and the opposition as warmongers. His and Orbán's stance on the war in Ukraine, which parrots Moscow's line that Kyiv and the West are to blame for the Russian aggression, is incidentally the same narrative the Georgian dream adopted in the run-up to the election to scare the pro-EU electorate.
To discuss the erosion of democracy in Central and Eastern Europe, I'm joined today by former Slovakian Prime Minister Iveta Radičová and Oana Popescu, former Europe Minister in Romania and currently Director of the Global Focus Center in Bucharest. Prime Minister Oana, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much for your invitation.
Always a pleasure, thank you.
Prime Minister, let me ask you first, when you watched the outcome of the Georgian election, did you get a feeling, I've seen this story before?
I am thinking if to say it such directly, to be open, not because I don't know what's going on, but because if you say such a sentence, then it's definitely reality. Yes, I am worried. I am worried because what's going on not only in East Central Europe, but in democracies all around the world is something we have to talk about, and not only talk, but it needs common and global action. Only please let me say two major figures. The last 20 years. Today, we have only 64 democracies around the world, but 74 autocracies. More, the transition from democracy to autocracy is today, at least last 4 years, the major trend. And what's going on in Europe, it's not only the change in the government you have mentioned, like Hungary, Slovakia, or Georgia today, but also in such pillars of democracy in Europe, like Finland, like Luxembourg, like Switzerland, like Netherlands, like Greece, Spain, but also Estonia, and many other countries. The last 10 elections last year.
But if I may, you know, I think
Sure.
maybe Oana can help us there, but I have a feeling that we need to distinguish between the fact that perhaps more radical parties are winning votes, or far-right parties or far-left parties are winning votes. But I think the distinction is, do they question the kind of democratic principle and governance principles? I haven't seen that much in Western Europe, and for some strange reason, it's happening in Central and Eastern Europe, which have this experience of autocracy before Soviet domination, and where democracy was something new, refreshing, and something these societies were struggling for so long. So why the backsliding now happens mostly here? Oana, can you shed some light on this?
I have to disagree that this is really not the truth picture, because the right or left populist parties have the common features and are absolutely the same, and doesn't matter if it's going on in eastern part of Europe or western part in Europe or United States. The problem is, I repeat, deeper. There is really, democracy is under the threat, and we have to openly say that populism and populistocracy is something as a counter ideology, not only in East Central Europe. Look at Bavaria, look at Germany, AfD in Germany, and many other political parties which have the same narrative, as you can hear from illiberal politicians in Central and Eastern Europe. But the problem is that there are differences concerning, for example, the interpretation and narrative towards the war in Russia, aggressor Russia in Ukraine. And this is one distinguished moment, because Prime Minister Fico, for example, has had an interview in Moscow, and he has openly said that it's the beginning of the war was because of the Ukraine and the Western world. So this is something which push us really to the corner concerning democratic values.
Okay, let me ask Oana then. Do you share this view that this is more or less the same trend everywhere, or are there any distinct features in Central and Eastern Europe about this democratic backsliding?
I usually agree with Iveta Radičová, but I differ a little bit this time, and I think we have three trends at the same time, and there are distinct features. Central Eastern Europe has a track record of authoritarianism and autocracy. So we know, and our political elites know, that this is a shortcut to accumulating more and more power. So I think this is one trend which essentially questions, challenges the basis of democracy, and seeks to create one-party states, seeks to accumulate as much power as possible in the hands of the ruling elites, and this is indeed an indicator for democratic resilience, whether there is a historical record of authoritarianism in the past, and an instrument that we developed a few years ago at the Global Focus Center, the Democratic Resilience Index, takes this into consideration and finds that there is a very clear correlation between this kind of history and which way currently these countries are going. Simultaneously, what we have in Western Europe, and it's really not better than Central Eastern Europe, is we actually have more extreme far right and far left parties in Western Europe. That's the difference. Central Eastern European ruling elites tend to go toward using institutions to centralize power. Western European radicals and populists seek to convince their electorates, so they actually genuinely reflect growing majorities or growing minorities, vocal minorities in their own countries. They are democratic and representative from that standpoint. They don't go against institutions and democratic practices. They actually follow them, but they do seek to expand the electorate that they appeal to, and they have more extreme views on things like migration, socially conservative policies, and so on and so forth.
So if I understand you... So if I understand...
And then the third trend that we have, which is very geopolitical, is in the European neighborhood, but it's also reflected in Hungary, in Orban's Hungary. And that is countries that no longer actually sign up to the European system of values and to the norms and rules of rules-based global order. Georgia is one such example. I think that the Georgian dream has essentially made a very clear choice to be like many Central Asian republics, to play the same game as Serbia in the Balkans, which is pay lip service to the EU and maybe NATO, continue to say that you're interested in EU and perhaps NATO accession, because the EU is willing to trade some favors, some money in exchange for that, but in reality have a multi-vector foreign policy where you clearly engage with pretty much everyone, not necessarily with Russia as a priority. And some countries do it to balance Russia, so they do it for fear of Russia, not out of sympathy for Moscow.
So Georgia could be an example of that, right?
And with everyone else.
So Georgia could be an example of this, right?
Georgia is absolutely an example of this already. Almost 100% of Georgian strategic infrastructure is in Chinese hands, and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development and the European Investment Bank are paying for a large share of these projects, which then China brands as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. And Georgians think this is Chinese investment in Georgia, and it's not. It's actually European investment in China's expansion in our backyard. The same goes for Turkey, for some of the Gulf countries. Georgia currently seeks to maximize and leverage its geopolitical position to extract money and favors from everyone, the goal being not necessarily the national interest, although it is marketed as such, but the political survival of the Georgian dream and its corrupt networks of influence, keeping it in power.
Right. Okay. Let me return now to Prime Minister Radičová. It seems that there is a pattern that Mr. Orbán invented in Hungary many years ago. You win an open election, then you capture all the nominally independent institutions by packing them with party loyalists. Then you subvert the courts and law enforcement, establish a state-linked oligarchy in business, and particularly in the media sector. So at the next election, you already have an advantage, you consolidate power, you can even change the constitution. And the next thing you do is you introduce Sovereignty Protection Office, which is supposed to, push back against any dissent. Is there a way out of this playbook for Central and Eastern Europe? Because it seems it's spreading to your home country, Slovakia.
First of all, only one sentence as reaction to my colleague. Don't forget that South Europe, as Spain, Greece, etc., has had the absolutely same experience with totalitarianism as Eastern Europe. So this factor and history cannot explain the differences. This is very important moment, what I am saying. And towards your question, we know from Larry Diamond 12 steps to autocracy. We know that the reaction to already 15 maybe more, 20 years long combination and complex of crises, migration, globalization, new technologies, financial crisis, energy crisis, pandemia, all together complex of uncertainties, chaos, very unstable governments, mixture of governments inside, very weak coalitions. And plus, what is the most important thing is the war in Ukraine. And all these together with former historical experience, doesn't matter if it is eastern part of Germany or South Europe or eastern part of Europe, meant that people have not only the fear, the people are looking for something stable, and they are open to the promises which has nothing together with a reality of solutions. And if they are open to the machos, to the strong hand, to autocracies, then they voted for autocracy. You know, also in Christianity, you can decide in between devil and angel. And if you choose devil, you have it. Problem is that if there is a personality and leader, because now we haven't typical program-oriented political scene, but leaders-oriented political scene, and if you believe to your leader, combined with disinformation media, then the way is open to lose your freedom. And you are losing it because of the promise of certainty, because of the promise of security.
Right,
and
but just you mentioned the devil, so maybe I'll play the devil's advocate now and go back a little bit to what Oana said earlier, which was that you know, in the West, you have these parties that, you know, feed on anger and issues such as migration and others you mentioned. But they're playing within the rule book. They're trying to capture more votes. And in a sense, you know, it goes back to your remark about leadership. They very often are appealing leaders. So let's reverse the question and say, is it not the failure of the mainstream parties to address some of these concerns of citizens and pushing agendas which are incomprehensible to people? So in a sense, it's just a democratic check and balance. The difference with Central and Eastern Europe is that some of these leaders try to rig the game. Oana, what's your comment on this?
Yeah, I would pretty much agree with you in the sense that absolutely we have a democratic deficit. In many countries, centrist policies are not convincing anymore. There's not enough innovation. There's not enough keeping up with the pace of change globally and with the challenges that we are facing globally. At the same time, it's a matter of being representative. Many centrist parties have become lazy. We have a crisis of leadership. And then these parties have stopped trying to really appeal to their electorate. They have stopped trying hard enough to reach out to the swing voters, the undecided, those who might be tempted by both left and right policies. So we do have a democratic deficit, and clearly, I wasn't even implying that an autocratic recent past alone explains what's happening in Central Eastern Europe. It's a combination of factors, and this combination is different from one country to the other. Indeed, I think that's the major issue. But then again, it's two different kinds of evil, and I would find it hard to say which is worse. In Central Eastern Europe, ruling elites tried to centralize power and rig the game. In Western Europe, ruling elites actually tried to stay in power by feeding fear and anger and populist sentiment, and they actually take people with them in that populist direction.
Right.
Both of them actually weaken Europe. That's the phenomenon that we're facing is a weakening European Union and a weakening Euro-Atlantic community in front of the challengers of what is perceived as the Western-dominated liberal order. And these challengers are on the march. They are very aggressive, they're very determined, and we are retreating and we are trying to cling to what we knew existed, and we're refusing to see that the world looks different and we should be talking to our electorates differently.
Right. Okay. Well, not to finish on a gloomy note, I'd like to ask both of you to comment on the fact that in one country in the region, in Poland, we're now sort of past this phase where democracy was a little compromised or eroded, if you will. And now the Polish government is trying to build back resilience into the democratic system. So is this something that indicates that the other countries in the region, Hungary, Slovakia, they can move back and follow, rather than following Mr. Orbán's playbook, they can follow the Polish playbook? Prime Minister Radičová first.
I am sure that we will survive. Only we have to, first of all, offer good governance. We have to increase the ability of civic society and their participation of citizens. Last but not least, we have to restart our economics. And last but not least, we have to put on the table better offer than those who are only working with fear, vulgar narratives, anger, and trying to find enemies. I think that people will recognize, and they have done it several times, also during the history of Slovakia, for example, that when they see that all these were empty promises, and that what tried to do this new leader is very far from what they wish to have as a functioning democracy, because this is true, they want to have it, then there is a chance for the leaders from democratic camp, but we have to have good offer.
Okay.
And here is the problem.
Oana, what's your take? And let me ask the second question so that you can answer them both, because we're approaching the end of the program. One factor we didn't discuss is, of course, the US election. And Prime Minister Radičová mentioned the fact that, there are other countries where democracy may appear shaky. And, these days, even the US looks a bit shaky in this regard. Donald Trump says he admires dictators, speaks darkly of the enemy within, and promises a purge in the US institutions. So what happens to Europe and the world if the US also adopts Mr. Orbán's playbook?
Well, look, there's more good news in the region. Ukrainians are dying for Europe and for freedom. The Republic of Moldova has just chosen EU accession despite fierce attacks from Russia. Georgian society remains pro-European, and the Georgian Dream Party had to rig elections to win them. So this is a battle that's being fought. The problem is, indeed, is our model appealing enough? And these countries are looking to what we're doing in Ukraine. And when I say we, I mean both Europe and the US, America in general, and the international community. They see that we are supporting Ukraine enough to resist, but not to win. So then obviously they will ask themselves, well, we have to live with Russia on our border from now on. If Russia decides to attack us, is Europe going to step in? Are the United States going to step in? Are we going to be able to prevail? And their answer is probably no, because they see that if we're not doing that for Ukraine, then why would they be counting on us? So then they are forced by geopolitical circumstances to try and beef up their defenses in every way they can. And if that involves closer relations with Russia to appease them, or with Turkey to balance Russia in the Black Sea region, or if it involves governments that try to take advantage of this vacuum and promote their own policies and centralization of power, then that's the reality. So I think the answer to your question is, If Europe indeed provides a strong offer, not just a tempting offer, but if the offer from the EU is strong and firm enough, and we deal with our own Orbans and Ficos, then we will be credible. And the same applies to the US, of course. If the US
we have to stop.
comes up with Donald Trump, then obviously we're losing our appeal.
Thank you very much. Thank you both for joining us tonight. Thank you for your insight and comments.
Thank you.
This was On the Record. Thank you very much for watching us, and see you next week.